Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first yng.ventures fireside chat with an awesome entrepreneur, investor, leader in the YPO/WPO community. I'm Alex Simon, one of the 3 or 4 YNGers behind this new YNG Ventures program. In short, we're trying to build a community within the YPO Next Gen world for folks interested in startups, early stage investing, where technology is going, all of that really good stuff. We're doing a bunch of things, organizing YNGers at a local city level. We have an event coming up later tonight in New York City. We have more going on in London and Mumbai next month. But today, I'm really excited to have a conversation over this Google Hangout format with a really awesome mentor, advisor, leader in a bunch of different spaces, Chris Schroeder. I've had the opportunity to know Chris for quite a while, had the opportunity to read his book, which we'll talk about, have even had the opportunity to walk around different cities in Iran with Chris. And I can tell you firsthand, this conversation will blow your mind, but you don't have to just take my word for it. Just this morning, a kind of legendary venture capitalist, Brad Feld, literally said the exact same thing about Chris on his blog, read the book, and said that he recently had dinner with Chris, and it was, quote, one of the most valuable conversations he's had this year. So we are in for a treat. And just a reminder that throughout the conversation, feel free to email me at alexmsimon@gmail.com with any questions you want to ask Chris, or throw questions into the event page on the Google Hangout. And this will be recorded in the event that anyone is unable to join. But yeah, great, Chris. So I think it would probably be helpful to kind of frame this conversation around what you're currently doing and how you got here. I realize that's a big thing, but I figure you can handle it.
Well, firstly, it's just great to be with you and with the great sort of next generation and future YPOers. And also thanks, Alex, as always, for putting it together. That was very nice what Brad wrote today, but I think he must have a very slow year if I've been the high point of it. But it was a wonderful conversation of a remarkable man who has done a lot in America, but is thinking also globally now, as I think more and more of Silicon Valley and other places in America are really starting to look beyond themselves at a time where the political dialogue, I think, has been pushing us internally. I think particularly the next generation is looking, much more globally and much bigger overall. Now, I spent about half of my time investing in and supporting American startups in Silicon Valley, but also in Washington and New York. I've been doing that for some time, and half of my life, which has been decidedly nonprofit, has been looking to build bridges between startups in the Middle East, Iran, Turkey, but also now I've been spending some time in Africa, Southeast Asia, and different other parts of the world, because what is so profound is that for all the cultural differences, for all the historic differences, for all the political differences, entrepreneurs everywhere, enabled by technology, they speak the same language, they come at problems the same way, they have the same needs and problems to incredibly universal levels. And to me, one of the most interesting questions of our time, we can have a whole discussion about the rise of AI, the rise of genomics, the rise of Bitcoin, and all these technologies are incredibly interesting to me. But what is even more interesting to me is that nearly 2/3 or more of humanity is now having access to smart devices, which means supercomputers, and that by the end of the decade or 5 years thereafter, it's going to be like 80%. And I think when you have that level of connectivity, that level of sharing those kinds of experiences I described, we're going to see something unleashed here that is completely without precedent in world history. I've been an entrepreneur. I built a company called healthcentral.com, which was a platform where people who've been there can share their experiences and help each other get through experiences or uplift each other if they're trying to do something wonderful, like run a marathon or what have you. But I've been an entrepreneur. I helped build the businesses of the Washington Post and Newsweek online, and a company called Legislate online. So I really know the pain and misery that entrepreneurs go through. I know those near-death experiences, and I think that's probably made me much more effective in this later chapter in my life, and certainly gave me a great lens when I interview people for the book.
Awesome. And we're going to get to some of the past history and what you're looking at towards the future, but focusing in on the book for a second, coming from having built companies, invested in companies, et cetera, how did this whole idea of what was going on around the world, and particularly in the Middle East, even come into your radar?
So, usually when Americans ask me, why do you care about the Middle East? My first reaction is, truly, why don't you? we're all very globally curious. We're all interested in the issues of our time. Certainly in my lifetime and the more recent generation's time, Middle East has been absolutely important to it. We tend to look at the Middle East through one lens, which of course has been war and conflict and the things that we typically see or engage with on, on the news, whatever news sources that we have. But the narrative is a little bit more one of embarrassment for me, because I have traveled. I've been to the Middle East as a tourist. I've been all over the world. In the companies that I've run, I've outsourced technology to just about any growth market that you could imagine. And when through your dad and a YPO subgroup, I began to meet Arab CEOs and American CEOs, and they started talking about what this universal access of technology was doing there. I had like no clue. I mean, I literally could not get it through my head, even though I outsourced technology to India, to Southeast Asia, across Latin America. I mean, everywhere in the world. I could not get it through my head that then Mubarak's Egypt was kicking out world-class software engineers, because my narrative bias was so strong. And so when I ended up starting to visit it in the lens of startups and technology, it just completely not only blew my mind in terms of what's happening there, but it blew my mind about myself, because I pride myself in not being too sucked into narrative bias. I'm always asking questions to make sure I'm not convincing myself that my own fumes are the right ones to inhale. And here I am missing an entire wave that's happening everywhere else in the world. Why wouldn't it be happening there? And in 2010, with your dad and a couple of these other YPOers, an amazing guy from Jordan, now Dubai, named Fadi Gondor, and another guy named Arif Nakvi, who's built the largest private equity firm in the region. They held the first great gathering of Arab startups in 2010. And my life is pretty much before that event and after that event, because it was 3,000 young people doing what we all in this call take for granted, with a waiting list of 3,000 people doing this. Nobody wanted to talk about political calamity. No one cared about President Obama's Cairo speech. Their heads were down building great software solutions to the problems and opportunities in their backyard. And that sort of changed my entire worldview.
Awesome. And it's cool also how YPO kind of created that like trusting ethos.
Absolutely.
I'm curious. I mean, obviously the prevailing narrative around the Middle East is like ISIS, chaos, Syrian civil war, etc. What are some of like the really crazy findings you've uncovered that really provide a countervailing force on that narrative?
And it's important to underscore that, I mean, that narrative, this is a tough neighborhood. And in fact, a lot of growth, countries and regions that are coming to the new world and adopting technology, it doesn't come easy. I mean, I just came back from Nairobi. There is a lot of exciting stuff happening in Kenya, and you see it a lot now on blogs. And Andreessen Horowitz did a fantastic podcast on what's happening in the startup community there. But the poverty is very profound. Political corruption is very serious. There have obviously been terrible terrorist attacks in the last year there. So we live in a complicated world, and I don't want to dismiss the narrative of ISIS and other things, because they are important and they are very real too. What's happening in Syria is beyond tragic. What is happening in Iraq is beyond tragic. This is real. I think the point is that many things happen at the same time. And so what people don't realize when they think about stuff like that is sort of takeaways like this. Like the largest per capita user of YouTube on earth is Saudi Arabia. The largest demographic is women, and the largest content area they're watching on YouTube is education. So think about the multiplier ramifications of that as women begin to enter more into society. In the last year, the largest food delivery company in Turkey, which is also in Dubai, got sold for over $600 million, a company called Yemiseptiki. And Soup.com, which is the Amazon of the Middle East, effectively, the major e-commerce player, just got a global venture capital and a valuation well in excess of $1 billion. People don't know that more people flew through the Dubai airport last year than flew through Heathrow 2 years in a row, in fact. And people don't appreciate that while there are now probably hundreds of thousands of startups happening the way that I've described them, the economist said 25% of them are women. And I can tell you, go to Silicon Valley, you're not going to find 25% of the startups, founded by women. So I think the takeaway is that there's something happening, and it's happening aggressively and seriously, but it's not on our radars. And I think when you just sort of project out in the near future, particularly, as I said before, more and more people have access to technology, not less. You will see people and bad actors using it for bad ends, but you're also going to see things which are very familiar to us because they're happening everywhere as well. And then the question becomes, why wouldn't it be there? If it happened in a place like Korea which was a complete backwater 30 years ago, it's going to happen everywhere. And that to me is the interesting dynamic to make your brain think differently about it.
Mm-hmm. So you wrote the book in, what was it, 2011 or published in 2012. What are the kind of big things you've seen happen since then that you would include in a forward to, the 2016 edition? And also, it does seem like some of the major stakeholders in like Silicon Valley and VCs who, in New York and elsewhere are beginning to take notice of this narrative that you're sharing. And what do you think is going to happen as a result of that? And will kind of actions be following their words of interest?
So there is actually a newer version out that I think Brad might have read, because one of the biggest shifts from the time I wrote the book in 2013 is, of course, the rise and opening of Iran. And from the trips I've shared together that the new generation there is just phenomenal. This could be, if the politicians embrace it and don't get in its way, this could be one of the most exciting new markets entering the global economy in our lifetime. I mean, these are amazingly talented young people, great engineering skills, very important infrastructure there, total access to technology. So that's clearly one major new dynamic that did not appear in my book. Though the book was focused on the Arab world, I didn't talk about the magnificent ecosystem that is Israel and didn't focus too much on Turkey. I think beyond that, there are a couple of things, and I'm about to write a series on LinkedIn along the line of your question, because almost every one of the entrepreneurs and ecosystem builders I wrote about in the book are thriving today. Either their companies have pivoted and started new things, but it's been kind of amazing to watch the ones that I focused on, how well they're doing today, like Sleep.com and what have you. But the other thing which is very exciting is I'll write a piece about a dozen new ones who would have been in the book if I wrote the book today. And the problem is there are thousands of new ones, certainly hundreds, but thousands of new ones in the last 3 years alone. And it's hard to actually do them justice because that kind of quantity is important. Which leads me to the third thing, which is, I think, the rise of Dubai and the UAE as a hub of talent is, I think, very misunderstood here in the West. I think a lot of people think of Dubai as this massive real estate play and a place where global business can come and get a drink and play and do stuff that global business people like to do. And there's truth to that. But I think what people underestimate is the quality and quantity of young people throughout the UAE government who are really working 16 hours a day to make sure that there's the infrastructure and the rule of law, and the openings to allow talent to come and succeed there for technology and innovation. So in the last 2 years, I can get on an elevator now in a building and I'll see a bunch of Egyptians that I know very well from that ecosystem, but they've moved to Dubai. And I'll run into kids from Lebanon who have moved to Dubai. So it's becoming kind of a network effect of talent. The more good people are there, the more good people want to be there. And it doesn't mean that they don't miss their home. It doesn't mean that they don't keep talent and operations maybe in where they're doing. But to make a really huge regional and potentially global impact, they're thinking this is a place that can be very powerful. The last one I would suggest is worth watching, and it's only worth watching because it's way too early to predict, and that is the young man who is the defense minister in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who has been taking charge of the economic planning for the future of a plan they call 2030. And if you look up any of the articles that have been particularly well done on Bloomberg and Economist and whatever, I have no idea whether this will work, but I can just tell you that there are conversations going on there and plans being rolled out there that I think most of us who've watched the region would not have predicted 6 months ago. And, as UAE becomes kind of a model for the region, if not for the world, I think other places will start to come on and see what they can learn and share from places like it in Singapore and Korea and others globally. And I think we're going to see a very interesting flywheel going forward.
Are you seeing any other particularly kind of enlightened in this way government leaders and state leaders throughout the region or in some of these countries, or is it mostly a bottom-up effort?
I think the exciting thing is that it is very deeply a bottom-up effort. I mean, I think that's one of the great stories that most people in Washington can't understand and a lot of big businesses can't understand, because these big traditional enterprises tend to think of the world as top-down. And when you have this ubiquitous access to technology, people are solving problems bottom-up, and often the two don't mix. I mean, there's conflict that can come with it, and or the young entrepreneurs just move very quickly and they just do their stuff in any event. But I believe at the same time that governments matter, that rule of law matters, that institutions matter, that education that focuses on real critical thinking and the tools and skills of the 21st century matter. And so it cannot be ignored. And the difference between an ecosystem that gets it and an ecosystem does not is enormous to an entrepreneur. So again, the UAE is very interesting. Jordan has been a leader for many years on this. The King of Jordan has really stepped forward maybe a decade ago in this part. Unbelievable potential in Egypt, some of the best entrepreneurs that I've met, but it's unclear whether the government really appreciates the opportunity that it has in helping the economy rise so that they can make the impact that they want to do. So it's early, but I think the thing that is still so exciting to me in the Middle East, but also around the world, is that despite the ecosystem, nobody's waiting for permission. So like some of the really just awesome and very creative entrepreneurs in Beirut, for all intents and purposes, Lebanon hasn't really had a government for several years now, and yet these amazing companies are being built and they're getting funded and financed and doing things in the region because entrepreneurs look at this top-down challenge and they say, well, we're going to keep coming. But again, it's just such an opportunity to open them up that I'm hoping over the next 5 years we'll see more of that.
Let's talk about Iran for a second, because I mean, from my experience, and you had gone once before the trip that we both went on. I mean, it was one of the most mind-blowing and invalidating experiences ever. What were your assumptions and expectations going into Iran as somebody who had already spent a lot of the time, in various countries, kind of like having your expectations confounded? And what did you find that was different? And yeah, what's exciting about Iran, particularly now after all this nuclear framework stuff has been agreed upon?
It's so funny. I had friends in Washington, a little bit older, but they were still people who were very global and well-traveled, who when they heard I was going to Iran thought I was crazy the first go around. And a couple of them even said, Chris, have you seen Argo? Like, what are you doing? Like, guys, Argo? Are you telling me I should go to Germany because of World War II films? I mean, what does that possibly even mean? But I think at the same time, with all my traveling and even time in the Middle East or in the Arab world, I really wondered, was I going to see a more sophisticated version of Pyongyang, right? I mean, it's obviously it was a police state. It's unclear at the time what changes were going to be happening. And of course, there's uncertainty today. So I'm not sure what my expectations were until when I got there and I saw, this just incredibly thriving metropolis, which is Tehran, with a lot of traffic and all, but it's new cars and new roads and new airports. So the infrastructure impressed me a great deal. And watching young people walk through parks, particularly women and men engaging very naturally and very easily, unlike what I've seen in some other more conservative parts of the world. All this to me was sort of an amazing thing about the beauty and potential of the people and the place. And then as we traveled around to different cities, and I saw more and more of it, and I saw people who were very eager to talk English, people who were very curious about America and very passionate about having some kind of engagement as things seemed to be changing with Rouhani at the time. It was actually almost moving to me. Now, you got a sense that every email that you read was being watched. You had a sense that you had to watch carefully the way you acted and behaved and had to be respectful to the circumstances. I wasn't sitting around and meeting with, people in the Quds force. This was really more of a tourist kind of a lens plus the young entrepreneurs. But I came away from it, again, saying, as I said before, the quality and quantity of these people with this amazing history and culture and pride that they have about it, and just desire to be in the global economy to make impact, for themselves and worlds bigger than that, was such a glaring takeaway for me that it left me, much more upbeat, though there's sort of plenty of there that has been negative and plenty of things which have happened that are problematic that worry me a great deal today.
Awesome. I'm curious. I mean, there's kind of some cognitive dissonance going on in my head, because on the one hand, I'm hearing you talking, and it's obviously incredibly exciting, how technology is kind of opening this up and how innovation can come from anywhere and all of this stuff. At the other side of the table, I live in New York, and, people watching live in San Francisco, and conveniently, because it's the YPO community, people watching live in 100 countries. But I'm excited about this. At the same time, I'm trying to figure out what my role and ability to tap into this exciting narrative would be, and to contribute to it and participate in it coming from one of the usual suspect kind of places where things are happening. I mean, how would you connect this to actions that, YPO Next Gen folks could take who are interested in this stuff?
It really depends on the plane. I mean, starting at a personal level, the single most important thing you can do is what you do, which is to go. I mean, I think this is one of the things which is, and this is such an essence of the YPO experience generally, but it is at the essence, I think, of the people that are either coming into it or the new generation who will come into it at some point, which is that there is no substitute for going. There's no substitute for being around these places and people and sitting and listening. I think in terms of kind of what's happening in the globe, I don't watch really much television other than Netflix and whatever, but if there was a news show that actually to me is really effective about how to think about the world, it's Anthony Bourdain's show of all things, where he goes around ostensibly to talk about food and culture, but ends up having these incredible conversations about business and politics, bringing out insight from the bottom up. And in a way, that's the model for all of us, to go there and just to meet people and to shut up and ask a lot of questions and build that sense of reciprocity, of connection. And from that, a million things will come, because success tends to bring success once those barriers come down. Your dad has this wonderful theme that he's been driving called Know Them. And it's a funny play on words, because it's K-N-O-W, them, meaning know them. You want to know people on their own terms, but it means know, N-O, them. Because the minute we think of people as them, already there's a dissonance. Already there's a block between, what kinds of engagement we have. So a lot of it begins there. I think secondly, particularly for people who are building business or entrepreneurial, who realize that their business, entrepreneurial enterprises are one click away from anyone who's got internet access, you could think much more affordably and easily about being global day one. And sometimes that means just building great software that people can access. Like everywhere that I've gone, everyone's on Facebook. Everyone. I don't care if Facebook is banned, they're on it. But I think at the same time, there are ways to build partnerships and relationships and co-author, to have real opportunities that I think have great mutual impact. And I think that's the terms. I mean, so often in history, when young business people or then established businesses come into places, they sort of come in almost imperially. And the best companies that have come in have realized that it's a very bottom-up experience. It takes a lot of time and a lot of relationships. Well, all this technology facilitates that in a very, very powerful way, which I have no doubt anyone on this call is already taking advantage of. It could do so in a multiplier way, just because the tools are at hand.
Awesome. I have a bunch more questions for you, but I'm going to pause and address some of the questions that are being asked by those watching. Santiago in Quito says, technology has been able to cross borders and allow people to bring services and products internationally, yet capital has not really followed, with concentration in Silicon Valley and a few other places. Do you think there will be a change in the way talent and startups are being funded elsewhere? And I guess a question for me to add on to that is, do you think the funding will be coming locally, or will be coming from some of these big kind of institutions in Silicon Valley? And
you're both asking not only one of the great central questions of the success potential of these ecosystems, but it's one of the most common things on people's mind. And so what you're seeing now, and this is amazing how universal it is around many growth markets, there's more and more angel money than ever before, though probably not enough. There's a little bit more A-round money, which is better than ever before, but nowhere near enough. But after A, there's almost nothing. And so what does this mean in real terms? It means I can get a little bit of money to start things up, because the cost of engineers, the cost of reaching markets, everything is very cheap. So if an angel round is $500,000 or $1 million there, it's amazing to watch what young people in Cairo do with $50,000. I mean, whatever, to kind of get through that seed round, 100,000 maybe more realistically. But that's there. Okay, so you succeed at the next level. Then there are limited numbers of people out there who can help out at the next round to get you to another level of growth. And that means two things. One is, if you don't find the money, a good idea may stagnate. And or secondly, if there's not a lot of competition, what ends up happening is what I call term sheet abuse. Because if there's no competing term sheets, some of these guys don't get the collaboration that comes with investing in startups. And they just want to be proud to say, I took 70% of your company in the first round, which is terrible for everyone, but it happens, I think, too often. Okay, let's say you get it right in the angel. Let's say you really start moving, start building some revenue and some profits even, and now you need some real money to become a $100 million, multi-$100 million company. You look around, and it's almost impossible to find the money. And some of the players who used to do this have gotten bigger, and they're still at the later stage of this overall. So what's the answer? Well, I think a couple of things. I think there are more and more A-round and later funds being raised. And often, to your question, they are in the region. There are probably half a dozen or more $50 million funds, $100 million funds that are being raised in the Middle East area alone to start going at later stage. Wamda Capital, that you know very well, Fadi Gondor, who I mentioned before, has founded, is nearly $100 million that he's deploying, certainly through the A round, with some follow-on capacity beyond and is thinking much bigger going forward as other people are. I've seen this happening in Colombia. I've seen this happening in Southeast Asia, but it's very, very slow. The question about Silicon Valley is an amazing one. I mean, at the end of the day, I talked to a lot of my friends there. I've gotten some of them to actually come to some of these gatherings in growth markets. And at the end of the day, particularly the best of them, you know, they have a lot of success 30 miles from their offices. And Silicon Valley is such a unique ecosystem of talent and such exceptional enterprises are being built there that in a way that it makes perfect sense for their strategy. But I think people are asking questions and they're trying to understand, short of opening up an operation in India, though some like Excel Partners have done that, certainly many have done it in China. But is there a way to be able to find this talent that's everywhere, doing the things that I've described, and be able to invest in them? There's still a bias in many Silicon Valley firms to want those companies located in Silicon Valley, or at least a hub there, for which maybe they could outsource the technology or whatever. What I think the evolution is going to have to be is that more and more young people don't want to leave home. And their markets are getting bigger and bigger that they don't need to leave home. And so I think we're in this period where groups like 500 Startups has led in being able to invest in some of these early stages anywhere in the world. 1776 here in Washington, D.C. is leading in putting money to work anywhere in the world. And I think success will breed success. Y Combinator has just recruited 3 or 4 companies from the Middle East to come to Silicon Valley to do it. And again, I think success will breed success. The last note I would leave you is, I think that Alibaba, which actually was having some trouble in the press today, but still made a very important epiphany to many people in Silicon Valley, in New York and elsewhere, which is this wasn't just another Chinese juggernaut supported by the government that went public at a multi-billion-dollar valuation. This is a multi-billion-dollar software-enabled company that has built mostly all of its business outside of the West. For the last 3 decades, to make it in technology meant to make it in the West, and it meant even to make it pretty much in the United States of America. So even the hardware companies like Sony and whatever, 10 or 20 years ago, Samsung, to make it globally in technology meant to make it by selling in this market. Now, because other markets are rising and middle classes are rising, and a company like Alibaba can make billions and billions in revenues, not just in its own country, but in emerging markets, that is a wake-up call to folks saying we've got to figure out how, in a sense of reciprocity, we can engage in multiple markets and grow going forward.
Awesome. Great. Ryan, who just texted me and said, is in Tel Aviv, so this conversation is particularly pertinent. So he thanks you. Says, given the small markets, i.e. Israel, or small markets that are able to pay, i.e. rural or agrarian, in some countries in the Middle East, what do you think the global expansion requirements are for new entrepreneurs there? And do you think these goals are achievable by most new businesses in the region? So yeah, are these going to be, that kind of goes to a question I wanted to ask, which is, what's kind of the breakdown between copycat companies you see coming up, which are not, necessarily bad things because there's big opportunity, and kind of novel solutions to unique problems in these different countries and regions?
Let me answer your second question first and then come back to Ryan's question, because they are linked, but I think there's a bit of a chronology to it. It has never ceased to amaze me how people use the term copycat almost like it's a pejorative. And in fact, in my book, I don't even use the word copycat. I call them improvisers, because while they do take e-commerce lessons learned, there's so much in the deployment of last mile logistics, language, cultural sensitivities that they're very important. Now, this is not always the case, and this is a huge thing to think about going forward. I mean, the Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Snapchat of almost any country on earth where the governments haven't blocked it are Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, and LinkedIn. And so there is a platform effect that can become instantly global. But there are these things happening not only hyper-locally, like the country or even city, but have ramifications across a region of shared language, of shared culture, shared logistical challenges, some similarities in government challenges, and just sensitivities, I think, emerging market to emerging market, which can become very, very powerful, and also is almost a defense of outsiders coming in and bringing the play over here. And I think it's incumbent. I mean, I think if you're a great engineer or a great entrepreneur in Jordan, to build a Jordan-only company is never going to be that big, right? Just by definition. So instantly you're thinking about the Arab world more broadly, or anywhere that people speak Arabic, or where people might be tied to you with religion or other cultural things, because that's the opportunity to make things that are bigger overall. Israel is just a fantastic example of this, maybe first of all, arguably second only to Silicon Valley. It's one of the great ecosystems in world history. And if you look at its history, in the early years, it was much smaller and it was focused much more on local and kind of smaller plays. And so exits might be $100 million or $200 million, maybe $300 million. And that was viewed very powerfully. And the engagement of the software or the engineering that was done would be maybe Israel only, or maybe some bridge between Israel and America. But now look at some of the juggernauts that Israel's building now, which are billion-dollar and even multi-billion-dollar exits. It is because that they now have a reach into global markets with world-class global software that's so powerful. I mean, everywhere I go on earth now, I run into Waze. Waze was this little company in Israel. I don't think they ever dreamed it would only be in Israel. And there's a reason why Google paid over $1 billion for it. So I think that there's kind of a path here. The early days are sort of copycat because a lot of cultures and societies can't believe that they can do it. They're worried about doing it. They're not sure that they can compete in doing it. And all of a sudden, a young entrepreneur shows up and says, do you like Yahoo? Yes. Do you like email? Yes. Do you like to be able to find goods and services in your backyard? Sure. Well, what if I did all that, but it was in Arabic? And that company then becomes a company called Maktub, which was acquired by Yahoo for nearly $200 million. It spins off a bunch of other companies which are familiar to us. It spun off Soup.com, and but it's very different from Amazon. It's different. Soup.com is now spinning off a new mobile payment capacity, which is very unique and very different. And then you just see kind of a staging of this. In the early days, it's a little more improviser, and then people solve more and more problems that have ramifications in their backyards that can expand to other markets. And that's when I think it becomes very exciting also.
Awesome, thanks. Santiago had a follow-up question to something you said earlier about the dangers of investors. I guess, I don't know if predatory is the right word, but investors trying to just scoop up as much as humanly possible in some of these markets in the early funding rounds. How do you think this mentality is going to be changed with investors? Is it going to be new investors or investors being burned by basically abusing the entrepreneurs the first time around?
All of the above, I think. I mean, look, there is no substitute in the ecosystem to have a healthy, growing, and expansive, not zero-sum game group. I mean, the idea that someone can own, venture capital in any one place, I think, is a dubious proposition. And I speak from the entrepreneur's perspective because that's where I care most, first and foremost. There is no substitute for the ability to have more than one term sheet. I mean, that's where the power shifts, and in fact, people can negotiate with as well. I think, secondly, to your point, the success breeds success is important. If someone gives away 80% of their company and only performs so-so, and someone else got to keep 80% of their company and went skyrockets, people will, I think, will appreciate that that's just convention, that if you can keep the management teams and the founders incented to do great things, they do great things. And in that case, you'd rather have 20% of them rather than 80% of them. I mean, that's such a convention everywhere in the world. It will happen, therefore, everywhere in the world, that it doesn't happen, I think, overall. But I think this is mostly about timing. It's about success, proving success, and eventually it'll become about quantity, because the more people that get in, the more opportunity there is, I think, to elevate these markets, but also give the entrepreneurs more leverage to be able to maximize their capabilities of making impact.
Awesome. On the subject of investors and investor styles, Cheryl, who I know is in Hong Kong working on building a startup herself, wants to know if you've seen much kind of geographic cultural variance across the investor communities you've seen. So Middle East versus US versus, I mean, her specific market is Asia right now. And she says that in Asia, a working business is usually required, i.e., I suspect traction, revenue, et cetera, before people are willing to invest. However, in the US, sometimes all that's needed is a really good concept and a great team. In the Middle East, kind of where on the spectrum do investors like to see a hit before they're willing to pull the trigger?
I think there's a tremendous cultural distinction in expectations and how people handle due diligence and the way they think about things. But I also think that diversity of spectrum you can see in any market, even the ones that are a little bit more mature in being in this space. I mean, you will see investors from America who require almost no due diligence, and it's very early, and they'll take a big portfolio effect and they'll put money in a lot of different companies and assume some of them will work out. There are other people that are very rigorous in the way that they look at it. The requirements of board seats and how much people want to get in and manage, I think, can vary across all the markets overall. But I think that Cheryl has a much better sense of how things are unique from Hong Kong and how they may differ from even Vietnam or Thailand and other places in Southeast Asia. And I think how the way investors look at things in Hong Kong may vary somewhat in China. So you have to be attuned to those variations and the dynamics of your markets. But at the end of the day, I think the best thing is to find entrepreneurial friendly investors. I mean, there is no substitute in my mind for the investor who's not only a good investor, but she has been there before and has lived through this stuff and seen these vicissitudes. And the problem is in a lot of these newer markets, there's not as many of that yet. And again, there is this problem that there's not as many, just generally speaking, overall. But to me, once again, that's a timing issue. And an entrepreneur, at some point, you have to take the money because you need to take the money. But on the other hand, the idea of having multiple people engaged and finding out who really understands you because she or he has been there before, to me, is a very, very good gating factor if you have the luxury to do some gating early on.
Terrific. I want to zoom in for the last bit of time that we'll be speaking on kind of two roles that YNGers are actively thinking of playing at this point. First, on the entrepreneur side, I mean, obviously, starting a tech startup is one of the quote coolest things like a person can do as far as like a trend goes. Do you think that some of that is overplayed? Do you ever caution people around, you know, what should make them really go ahead and pull the trigger on starting a company, or what should make them kind of have pause about jumping off that proverbial cliff?
It is a proverbial. I mean, that's the thing. When people think it's cool, or when I talk to entrepreneurs who you can just tell when they're pitching their businesses, they're pitching the cool factor. It almost is the end of the meeting for me. I mean, this is the dirtiest, ugliest, least cool thing you can do if you're going to do it well. It's hands dirty. It is psychologically challenging in the sine waves of now you're feeling like you're about to take over the world, and then something happens that means you're not going to take over the world, and then all of a sudden things come up again, and you've got to kind of wrestle through this stuff with very little resources, and you have to not let your team know that you're, you know, in the low end of the sine wave when you're there. I mean, this is hard stuff. There is nothing sexy about it. Now, the other side of it is with these tools to have a dream and to have a vision of something that matters unbelievably to you, and you call that cool or whatever. I mean, it's unbelievably validating. It's unbelievably emotively exhilarating to be able to build a team and have people around you that are on a mission together where you're co-authoring something that may not have been there before, or taking something that's been problematic and making it better, faster, easier, cheaper, and that kind of stuff. But I tell entrepreneurs this all the time, and by the way, it's in multiple languages. If you're thinking about this and you think that this is like some movie, read Ben Horowitz's book, which for me is one of maybe 3 books that I wish were written when I did, you know, my first company, because, you know, his company's Ben is a very successful venture capitalist, obviously in Silicon Valley at Andreessen Horowitz, and the company that allowed him to do that, Opsware, ended up being sold to HP very nicely. But the near-death experiences and the difficulty of a decade that went into having that happen is not only profound, but incredibly inspirational, educational, empathetic, and it should knock out anyone's sense that this is just kind of cool, because cool tends to work itself out. I mean, there are exceptions of very audacious entrepreneurs who live audacious lives and build great companies, but the lion's share of them are people who are willing to get their hands dirty and be very focused and work very, very hard. And you know, you can slow them down, but you can't stop them. I mean, they have this intense internal courage, which is not just bravery, but it's like look, I'm just going to make it happen. I'm going to keep making it happen, which not all of us have. And so that's the way that I think about it. And look, I got to tell you, when I look to invest in companies or when I meet entrepreneurs for the first time, the first meeting, certainly the first half of the meeting, like they try to go to their deck, I tell them to put their deck away. And I just spend time talking to who are they? Where are they coming from? Why are they doing this? I mean, that to me is as essential almost as a game plan, which will probably change in 6 months in any event. So, you know, I think when people think that this is cool and sexy because it gets a lot of hype and there's a great HBO show of it and anything else, they're missing what is the real beauty in doing it, but also the very serious gut check they have to decide whether or not they've got it in their teeth to make it happen.
Yeah, I feel like there's a quote somewhere, maybe it was Mark Andreessen, who said the 2 states, the 2 emotional states of running a startup, or like abject terror and euphoria, or
total euphoria or abject
Yeah.
terror. There's no emotion in between. And trust me, from my own experience, it could not be more right.
Exactly. So you mentioned Ben Horowitz's book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things. I'm curious, what were the other two books of the three books you mentioned that are kind of critical that you wish you'd had? And also more generally, like besides talking to people and having built this network where you kind of have like a central nervous system of what's going on in the region and elsewhere, where do you read things? Do you follow certain VC blogs? Where are you learning that other people can kind of take a look at as well?
I am processing information. Anytime that I'm not in a meeting or doing something constructively that I have to do specifically for the world, or the work that I'm doing, I am constantly reading. I mean, I'm reading all the time. I actually make time to have meals with people who are doing things I'm curious about so that I can effectively just talk to them and share ideas, but really fundamentally learn from them. There really is no substitute in going out and just having that one-on-one contact with friends and new friends and people that I meet in Silicon Valley and around the world. So that's actually a big part of my I mean, I'm on Twitter all the time, not because I overly tweet, though maybe I do, but mostly when I tweet, I'm retweeting stuff I've read that is interesting because I hope other people will find it interesting. And so that's a big part of the way I'm just constantly processing and questioning my theories. As a corollary to that, I mean, the reason why I write, the reason why I've written articles and blog posts and things like the book is that I get a lot of noise going on in my head. The ability to distill what's in my head in 750 words, or in the case of a book, forced me to get away from the bullshit. I mean, it forced me to really say, do I believe what I'm saying? Do my arguments hold water? What are the data points that I'm missing? It's actually a very refining point to me. I mean, all the guys, Brad Feld and Ben Horowitz, I mean, all the kind of obvious people, Fred Wilson that you follow and everybody you follow are still, incredible encyclopedias of pattern recognition and ideas who've been there before. And there are dozens of people that I follow who are actually doing stuff and pushing different barriers of questions that I'm curious about. Ben's book, I think, is really something in itself. Reid Hoffman has had two books out so far. One is A Startup of You, which actually tells you a lot about you and your engagement as you think about your career, but within an organization. And then he just wrote a book about a year and a half ago called The Alliance, which is a very short book, which is really pressing us to think about the contract between employer and employee as world is changing, as expectations of a new workforce are changing, as technological tools are changing, as globalization is still such a large ramification. And I found those three books incredibly provocative and just thinking about the world. Same Peter Thiel's book is a very provocative one about where worlds are going. And there are many. I don't read a lot of business books, interestingly. I get a lot of inspiration from history. I get a lot of inspiration from just great writing. When I do read nonfiction, a lot of it is about the regions I'm going to visit and trying to understand the context I'm visiting in. But a lot of these great books are absolutely worth reading. And as I say, none of this existed 10 years ago, and I wish they all did. I would have been a better CEO if they had.
Awesome. So Io, who's leading things up on the yng.ventures front in Mumbai, wants to know, first he gives the disclaimer, sorry if this isn't interesting for anybody else, but have you heard of Bitcoin or applied cryptography, blockchain? If so, how do you think companies will or should approach this nascent, promising technology?
So I don't know how old I look on the camera, but I'm almost mildly offended that he asked me if I ever heard of blockchain or Bitcoin, which I think is actually one of the most important phenomenon of our lifetime now. And it's very funny because I helped invest in a company not too long ago, great young entrepreneur, very shortly out of college. And I asked him if I could get on his Slack. And he immediately said, you know what Slack is? And I'm like, oh shit, like this is, the generation is changing. But I really do think, there's a lot of this sort of ups and downs about Bitcoin was everything, now Bitcoin is nothing. And that always happens with technology, by the way. But I think when you strip away the essence, starting first with blockchain and this idea of having, what is fundamentally a ubiquitous and shared ledger where people can not only do transactions, financial transactions, whether it's Bitcoin or another new capability coming forward, but the ability to move information and data and music and content and any kind of information anywhere, anytime, completely safely in ways that we can verify it. I mean, it's like unimaginable even 3 or 4 years ago. And when I see people like Balaji Sarasian at A16Z with his new company 21, which is trying to facilitate computing to be computer-to-computer transactions, because you need something that sort of gets the flywheel moving of people's comfort with cryptocurrencies and using blockchain. I just think that we're in early days of it and it's moving very quickly and very interestingly. The very fact that major financial institutions are trying to figure out not just how to stop it, but to engage and leverage it, I think is highly indicative. But the most exciting stuff, I still believe, is going to happen quickly and around it. And to the essence of our conversation, I believe that the lead is going to be in growth markets, because you talk about societies that are incredibly educated, which are incredibly technology comfortable with having increasing technology for the first time. One of the most important questions to ask is, where will all the leapfrog come? Because if you never had landlines and everything is mobile first, and you have incredibly fat access very, very quickly, there are all sorts of things you can do because you're not tied by any of the legacy thinking, let alone actions of way things are doing. So if you're an underbanked society, if you're a society that's got mobile for the first time, if you've not been able to move money, even if you're in a place like Kenya where you can move money digitally, but it's a texting capability through banks and through the mobile provider called M-Pesa, you start looking at what Bitcoin and the ledger capability can offer, and you say, man, I'm about to leapfrog into many, many things of potential that we could not have even had a conversation about if we were meeting about this, even 2 years ago. So I'm a big bull on the potential here. I think there are going to be lots of ups and downs, but I think one, it's very, very important. If I were coming out of college today, this would be one of 2 or 3 areas I'd be focusing my time on in a career. And I really do think that the growth markets, I don't even call them emerging markets anymore, the growth markets are going to be very, very interesting here. By the way, there's a wonderful startup called BitOasis you guys should check out of Jordan. Amazing woman, entrepreneur, Ola Dudan, who just raised a bunch of capital. And I'm very excited by seeing what she's going to do in the Middle East with that capacity.
Awesome, thanks. You teed up one of my final questions, which was, besides Bitcoin, blockchain, et cetera, what are the other areas of opportunity you're most excited about that you'd recommend mid-20-year-olds checking out to get on the curve or ahead of the curve of what's going to be important?
I mean, we could spend well over an hour just talking about. I mean, this is. I mean, again, if you're whether you're doing it on your mobile device or the old paradigm way, if you're listening to the news today, you think this is the worst, most convoluted time in history. This is a very complicated time in history. There are a lot of people hurting right now, but there's no time in history I'd rather be alive. I mean, never have we had more tools to bring to these problems. I think in very powerful ways that we're only in the early days of thinking about them. And like every technology, though, will have two-edged swords, but I think the net positives are unbelievable. So again, I think blockchain and cryptocurrency is an area that intrigues me no end. Genomics and the ramifications of cancer treatments and disease diagnosis because of the understanding of the genetic code, I think is going to completely revolutionize both health and treatment and the way that we engage and think about ourselves overall. Obviously, artificial intelligence and VR is, the media we're going to be talking about in a whole new world of storytelling in media in the next 3 to 5 years, but also the way we do surgery and medicine, the way, again, we diagnose disease, the way that we can have experiences. I mean, if I'm having a shitty day and all of a sudden I could go in my office and I'm in Amman, Jordan, just breathing and enjoying it because that's the experiences I can create for. So we can't understand what that's going to mean for us as a society and our ability to facilitate in powerful things for us. Space blows me away. I do think we'll go to Mars in my lifetime. I do think that we're going to be traveling across the world at a fraction of the time that we're traveling now. I do think we will harvest incredible resources from the moon, which will change a lot of dynamics here. We'll be able to come at environmental challenges in very new ways. And a lot of these things all rolled together, of course, talk about things like driverless cars and the new way of thinking about roads and parking and the way we think about cities. I mean, all of this is happening now. And it's not like we're thinking about it 20 years from now. I think one of the aspects of software not only being universal but working is that all the different things I've talked about are interconnected. If you have great data science and if you have great data aggregation and great data carving, if you have great software that works, if AI is getting better, I mean, all these things make genomics better. It makes self-driving cars more affectatious. I mean, we're in this sort of amazing flywheel for which anyone with ambition to solve problems are going to be able to solve them through any of these kinds of understandings and capabilities. Now, people will say to you, but robots will steal our jobs and that bad things will also happen from what I'm describing. And I can't argue. I have no crystal ball. But I will say that there's always been 2 edges of technology. I don't think Orville and Wilbur, in their wildest imaginations, in Kitty Hawk, envisioned their invention bombing the shit out of Dresden in World War II, or dropping an atom bomb, or flying their crafts into buildings. I mean, The thing that technology does not do is change yet human nature. And so there are lots of things that we wrestle. There are lots of problems. There are going to be a lot of counter reactions to what I've talked about, but I come back to where I was. There are more tools in more people's hands to solve more problems today than any time in world history. And it's hard for me to understand how anyone is other than hopeful, not optimistic maybe, but hopeful in that.
Awesome. Besides like a little question at the end, I wanted to ask a final question of not necessarily on like a business or sector related opportunity note, but what kind of life advice would you offer your 25, 26-year-old self? And also, what's the best advice you've ever received?
Yeah, I've gotten so much great advice over the years. And of course, part of the risk is sometimes you get too much advice. And I think when you're coming into your career, I mean, if you ask too many people, too many opinions, you can get 360 degrees of advice, which leaves you nowhere, which then therefore goes to probably the thing that I would leave you with most, which is that very often in life, they're not right answers. But I really do believe in my heart that there are true answers. And that true answer is about you. Like you can intellectualize why you're going to a graduate school. You can intellectualize why it's better for your planning to take this job over that job. But if you know in your gut and your heart that you're not going to fit in what you're about to do, I mean, maybe it's worth sucking it up. And even if you fail, failure is an awesome thing that can help you pivot into something new. But I really do think that often people, not just young people, I have it with friends of mine my age and older, they have a norm of what they think they ought to be. And they're not asking themselves what they truly are, where they're most comfortable in their skin, how they can keep away from things that they naturally avoid so they can maximize what their capabilities and what their happiness is in whatever it is they're built. I know a lot of young entrepreneurs who frankly they just shouldn't be entrepreneurs. They bought into the cool thing. They're embarrassed that their friends are doing, they're not doing it, but it's just not their nature. And they're wonderful, unbelievably gifted people who will make huge impact in the world, but that's not quite the fit. You and I have dozens of friends who went to or are in law school, and they're there because they couldn't figure out what else to do. I mean, how do you spend 3 years of your life and all that money when it's just sort of like a thing? I mean, so it's hard to say this because I don't want people to relax too much because that fear and tenacity, bit of a chip on our shoulder, helps us to do really impactful things. But I do say relax. I mean, keep focusing on what's true other than what's quote unquote right. And don't be too hard on yourselves. I mean, just keep that as a rudder, and sometimes it'll work out, sometimes it won't. Everything's an opportunity for the next thing. And that I think is very hard when you're in it to keep focused on, but is absolutely essential.
Awesome. Great. As always, it's been insane and difficult and awesome to try to keep up with you on this conversational roller coaster. But yeah, I really thank you on behalf of all the other folks watching. Final, 2-word question: who's the next YPOWPOer we should have on this hangout?
I don't think there's anybody better on the issues that I'm talking about than Fadi Gondor. I mean, you go with Arif. I mean, you can go through the people who are changing the world. Bobby Sager. I mean, there are just great people who have done amazing things in business and are doing amazing things broader. I'm happy to sit with you and help you build a list.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks so much.
By the way, if you want to do blockchain or Bitcoin, Wences Caceres, who runs one of the chapters in San Francisco, is obviously all in. And so if you want to go subject specific there, he's awesome. Magnificent.
I will be following up on that, and you'll be happy to know that Io, after referring or implicitly referring to you as old, is now taking a lot of flack on the Google Hangout event page. But yeah, thank you as always, sir. You can find out more about Chris's stuff at startuprising.com.
Startuprisingbook.com.
Startuprisingbook.com. Follow him on Twitter at CMSCHROED. Just Google him, do things that way.
And buy the book because I'm giving all the proceeds away to a great social enterprise in the Arab world. So it's not for me. All right.
Which we'll have to talk about in a subsequent conversation at some point.
Talk to you, buddy.
Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us for this first of hopefully many chats with leaders in the YPOWPO community. Reminder that there's an event tonight in New York. Shoot me a note if you'd like to learn more about that. Thanks a lot, Chris. Have a great day.
See you guys. Bye.